Reddit, the website that the internet loves to hate. While Reddit's definitely seen its fair share of cesspools over the years, it's come a long way from the festering den of incels that it used to be. I would say that nowadays it's downright mainstream. There's good, there's bad, but mostly, there's fake stories. The subreddit AmITheAsshole in particular has grown out of being just a judgment subreddit. It's the foundation of podcasts, YouTube channels, a reliable source of Twitter discourse, and now apparently it's a source for news sites to pull from? Which is absolutely wild to me because your average AmITheAsshole post is about as non-fictional as your average Wattpad story about a 14-year-old being sold to One Direction. But really, it's not about how real the story is, it's about how fun it is to read. And what can I say? I love a fake story from time to time. I love reading them, I love leaving a comment as if it involves a real person's life even if it obviously doesn't. I even enjoy writing my own steaming pile of bullshit from time to time. But the more you read on AmITheAsshole, r/amiwrong, and similar anecdote sharing subreddits like r/relationships, r/relationship advice, off my chest, and petty revenge, you start to notice some patterns. Like, oh, here's the scheming mother-in-law again. Ah, the easily offended fat person, I swear I've seen you around here every week. Another bridezilla. And what do you know? Welcome back, alienated relative who squandered all their money and now expects to be supported by their estranged family. Eventually it dawned on me that these categories are so numerous and so granular that you could basically make your own TV tropes just for fake Reddit stories. And this leads me to about a month ago when I was doing my typical Reddit lurking and decided to make this tweet. I'm gonna become a Reddit bait post taxonomist, a sampling of proposed categories. Unreasonable autistic person, unreasonable fat person, unreasonable trans person, evil gold digger cheats on perfect man, horrific abuse story, plausible, horrific abuse story, nonsense, send tweet. And then I patted myself on the back for another top-notch post and went back to playing my 3DS. But then it dawned on me, wait, could I actually do that? Could I actually sort every type of fake Reddit story into its own category? And more importantly, could I monetize my decision to do that? And thus I took to Reddit, going one post at a time down the most popular covert creative writing subreddits, and sorting each story into a category if one already existed, or making a new one to fill in the gaps. And I did this again, and again, and again, until I could go 100 posts in a row without creating any new categories, therefore creating a comprehensive Reddit bait post taxonomy. This is a bit different from my usual uploads. If you're new here, I usually make retrospective essays about Flash games, defunct virtual worlds, and occasionally cartoons from the 2000s. But I'm hoping that it's internet-centric enough to not be entirely off-topic and algorithmically nuke my channel! You may be wondering why I decided to make this, and the answer is twofold. First, I would like to raise awareness about the fact that so many stories on Reddit are fake as hell. Not to get people to stop reading Reddit or to stop writing these fake stories even, but to encourage people to not treat these stories as accurate reflections of reality and to discourage them from informing your view of the world. And second, to encourage the fake story writers to diversify their shit a little bit. Because if your story is accounted for in a subcategory on this list, then it's already been done to death. Not the wider categories though, because they basically account for every single type of interpersonal conflict. Now this video has a few content warnings. Actually, it has a lot of content warnings. All of these are pretty mild. I'm not going to be talking about them too deeply or for too long, but they will be alluded to and example posts will be given. So, we've got abuse and cruelty to critters and humans and illness and divorce and death. There's racism, bigotry, stalkers and cheaters and drug abuse including meth. There's trafficking, kidnapping, car crashes, gambling, incels and misogyny. There's fatphobia, homelessness, religious trauma and poor treatment of progeny. There's ableist creepers, abortion and miscarriage, varied harassment and such. There's LGBT hatred and families and couples who really are doing too much. For the purposes of this video, I will be using the following definition of Reddit Ragebait. A fictional or exaggerated story posted on a subreddit intended for advice, judgment, or other nonfiction for the specific purpose of making people angry, disgusted, or offended. This means there's going to be a few exclusions from this classification, even if they may technically count as a Reddit bait post. Number 1. No reposts from other social media, original Reddit content only. 2. Written content only, no photo or video-based posts. 3. Nothing from a subreddit made for admitted fiction. 4. Posts about interpersonal conflicts only. And 5. No bait with a goal other than making people angry, disgusted, or offended. For example, bait posts that are intended to be funny don't count. There needs to be at least one aspect of the story for the audience to get upset about. Let's begin with a few important principles about Reddit Ragebait. The principle of uncertainty! For people to be willing to engage with bait, it needs to be grounded in reality. Therefore, unless the poster has provided extremely concrete proof or has admitted that it's fiction, it is always uncertain whether any given post is real or fabricated. Many posts that seem extremely realistic are actually creative writing. Some posts that seem like total nonsense, while maybe not a totally accurate reflection of reality, are at least someone's honest recounting of events. Therefore, for the purposes of this video, we need to assume that all types of stories that elicit a strong negative emotional reaction from the readers are fictional. Because even if many of them aren't, there are always fictional derivatives of those real stories. So if you see any of these and think, hey, that's not bait, that happened to me, I'm very sorry to say that your real-life experience has been co-opted into fictional stories for internet points hundreds or even thousands of times over. The principle of intentionality! For the purpose of categorizing these story types, we need to assume the viewpoint of the author. What do they want us to believe? And by that I mean the person writing the story and not the character they're taking on as they're writing the post. Because what the author wants us to believe and the expressed opinions of the viewpoint character are often very different. Many of these stories, when examined more realistically, may reveal that the villain character actually has some perfectly rational explanation behind their behavior. But so long as they are portrayed and received by the audience as villainous and unreasonable, that's what we have to consider for the purposes of these categories. Of course, you can't always accurately gauge any writer's true intentions. But when it comes to Ragebait, however the audience is receiving the story is usually how the author intended it to be received. For example, it's often perfectly reasonable for a trans person to lash out after being repeatedly misgendered. But if the author wants the audience to think that they're an unstable weirdo for that reaction, then the post is going to have to go into the unreasonable trans person category, regardless of how unreasonable that person is actually being. These two principles establish two rules that we have to consider for all of these classifications. 1. Just because a post falls into a bait category doesn't guarantee that it's a fake story. And 2. When a post falls into a specific category, that's probably how the author intended for it to be interpreted, and doesn't always mean that that category accurately describes the nature of the conflict. And so now let's finally get onto the categories. Hold it! Before we can talk about the categories, we need to talk about the universal modifiers. These apply to every single story and are attached to the end of a post's categorization to give additional context. The first set of modifiers are types 1, 2, 3, and 4, which ask the question, who are we mad at? If the one who posted the story is the one who readers are mad at, then it's a type 1, equivalent to a you're the asshole judgment. If the person the poster is in conflict with is the one we're mad at, then it's a type 2, equivalent to a not the asshole judgment. Then there's the slightly less common type 3, which is when we're mad at everybody involved, equivalent to an everyone sucks here. Even more rare is the elusive type 4, where the asshole is society at large. This is when nobody involved can be directly blamed for the conflict because the issue is structural, like capitalism or lack of mental health support. The next set of modifiers are related to the post's believability, each one represented by a letter. First is type R for realistic. Type Rs are highly grounded in reality, nuanced and subtle, describes a situation that's just awful enough to be enraging, but not so alarmingly awful that a lot of people are going to be like, wait, I think this is fake. A step down on the realism scale is type M for maybe. This is when the realism of the story is basically a toss-up. Like, it seems oddly one-sided, or there's some details that seem kind of improbable, but not enough that it counts as obviously fake. And finally, there's type BS for bullshit. These are stories that are obviously completely fabricated. In type BS stories, the villain is so cartoonishly evil that it doesn't sound like it's describing a real person. The details have glaring issues. Things happen that couldn't or wouldn't happen in real life. Or the whole thing basically just reads like a Darman video. This RMBS category, while useful for providing additional context to a story's categorization, is extremely subjective and bound to have conflicting opinions on which stories fit what type. A person with a very low believability threshold is likely to categorize most stories as type R, even if most people would say it's actually a type M or even BS. And a highly skeptical person, or somebody who's over-aware of Reddit's proclivity for fake stories, is more likely to default to type BS. Unfortunately, watching this video is likely to turn you into that last kind of person. That's why I try to hinge this categorization on things that are more concrete, like amount of comments expressing doubt, how much positive or negative attention those comments are getting, if it's been cross-posted elsewhere to point out how fake it sounds. However, this is not a foolproof solution because in my experience, there are a few categories that have a way lower believability standard than others. The Unreasonable Minorities category, for example, is way more likely to have posts that I would label as an obvious type BS, with comment sections that would indicate that it's an M or even R. Because no matter how much Redditors love to pretend that they don't seek out any reason to ridicule minorities, they absolutely do. I also drop a post into type BS if it contains an extremely improbable interaction, like a total stranger going out of their way to tell somebody off for something that nobody in real life would ever have a problem with. And I do this regardless if anybody in the comments is picking up on how fake that detail is. To use these modifiers, I just append both types to the end of any categorization. For example, if there's an AmITheAsshole post that gets a "you're the asshole" judgment and it seems like total nonsense, that's a type 1 BS. If the character the poster is in conflict with is the asshole and the story is subtle and well-grounded in reality, that's a type 2R. And to cover all of our bases, a story where everyone involved is awful and the believability is just so-so would be a type 3M. Now it's time to actually talk about the categories for real. This list contains 30 categories that break down into several subcategories and occasionally microcategories. And for each subcategory, I'll be offering an example post. And you might be thinking, what, you actually went and found an example post for all of these? That's impressive and/or pathetic. But no, I didn't, because that sounds like a waste of time and I didn't want to risk drawing harassment to any of these OPs. If you didn't know, OP stands for Original Poster. We're going to be hearing that abbreviation a lot today. Instead, me and my collaborators came up with a bunch of example posts because that's functionally identical to how these are written in real life. And then I just inspect-elemented them into reality. No, we didn't actually spam Reddit with these. Like any good taxonomist, I'm just trying to observe the ecosystem, not disrupt it. And now, in alphabetical order with the categories and vibes-based order in the subcategories, let's begin with two hefty ones in a row: abusive/toxic family and abusive/toxic relationships. And you know what they say, family first. Abusive/toxic family, posts involving relatives with terrible behavior. First off, romance meddling. Family, usually parents, are over-concerned with the romantic life of their relative. This includes attempting to force a breakup, not respecting their choice to remain single, setting up unwanted dates, or attempting to arrange marriage, refusal to acknowledge their family member's sexuality, or insisting that their same-sex relationship is just a phase. Or, if the OP wants to get spicy, trying to steal their partner. Next, pull-out game week. In this subcategory, the parents will not stop having children despite how physically, emotionally, or financially unprepared they are to care for the ones that they already have. This includes the microcategory teen parent. A very young parent refuses to consider abortion or adoption despite how unprepared they are for the realities of childcare. Then we've got favorite child, where one sibling in the family is clearly treated with much higher regard than the others. An example of this is a post describing a family where the parents only pay for one child's secondary education and none of their other siblings for reasons other than a sudden shift in their financial situation. Bonus points if the favorite child ends up squandering their degree or drops out. Next is My Baby Now. This post involves somebody, usually a relative but occasionally not, attempting to usurp the role of the parent in the child's life. This is usually because they're not able to have children or too old to have any more children of their own. The reverse of that is Your Baby Now. A parent attempts to push the caretaker role for their baby onto a relative or friend, especially one who does not voluntarily or happily accept that role. For example, the OP's sister keeps dropping off her baby so she can go party without asking permission first. Next is a common toxic family dynamic, parentification. This is when one or more children is expected to take on the role of a full-time caregiver to one of their younger siblings or a severely disabled sibling. Then there's dumpster fire relative, which describes a conflict with a relative who is extremely unpleasant in some way, like always starting fights, behaving inappropriately at family functions, getting recklessly intoxicated, extremely poor hygiene, etc. For example, a post where somebody has to kick out their drunk uncle from their kid's birthday party because he got wasted and took a whiz in front of everyone. Next up is excessive punishment, where a child receives a punishment from their parent or caregiver that is much more severe than their offending behavior, which may have not been worth punishing in the first place. For example, a post where the OP is a parent who grounded their kid for weeks for saying something that could only be interpreted as disrespectful if taken in the most bad faith that they possibly could. Another unreasonable parenting category is Because I Said So, where the parent or caretaker is imposing unreasonable demands on their children or forcing them into situations they can't tolerate for no other reason than to exert their authority. On the opposite end of excessive authoritarianism, there's excessively hands-off. where the parents shrug off responsibilities as far as their kids' safety, routine, hygiene, medical care, and other things that kids struggle to deal with on their own. Like a parent taking zero initiative when their 13-year-old son starts getting bullied in school for stinking too much. Next up is pack your bags, a conflict involving a family member who refuses to let their relatives live with them anymore, or who refuses to allow them to move in or temporarily stay. Usually the person refusing is a parent, but you'll see this one with every variety of relative. For example, maybe somebody's mom strong-armed her way into moving in after she got divorced, and now they feel like she needs to move out because she's preventing them from having a healthy personal life. Then there's absent parent, referring to a non-divorced couple with an extremely unequal workload as far as housekeeping and child rearing. The absent parent's absence could be physical, emotional, or both. And we round out the group of questionable parenting subcategories with what autonomy? Where the parent or other familial authority figure becomes extremely upset upon realizing that their child, especially an adult child, has the ability to make decisions for themselves. For example, a post where somebody's mom goes into a crying, screaming rage over the fact that they cut their hair short. Next up is criminal relative, a conflict involving a relative who is a criminal or was accused of a crime. This frequently involves another relative being expected to forgive this person by the rest of the family. Like a post where a teen is expected to welcome their uncle back with open arms after he was released from prison for killing a homeowner when he was trying to rob their house. This is always a fun one. Surprise DNA results! Relatives learn that they are less related to each other than initially assumed due to the results of a voluntary DNA test. Keyword voluntary because DNA tests that are forced by their partner go into a different category. For example, somebody taking a 23andMe expecting nothing special and end up finding that all of their siblings have different fathers. Then there's a trio of conflicts that belong to different categories depending on who is doing it. First, there's retaliatory destruction, where somebody destroys their family member's belongings as punishment or because they're upset. Tantrum thrower, where a relative or several get into unproductive screaming matches instead of communicating. And finally, domestic violence, which is self-explanatory. Next category, abusive/toxic romance. Posts where the OP is in a terrible relationship. Beginning with a sad reality for many new parents, baby switch up, where a relationship suddenly turns sour as soon as there's a pregnancy or birth. Like a situation where somebody's husband is all loving and doting throughout the pregnancy, but as soon as he's faced with the reality of childcare, he becomes completely mentally and physically checked out. Then there's completely oblivious, where the OP is thoroughly convinced that their relationship is not that bad, no matter how cartoonishly evil they or their partner is behaving. For example, maybe the post title is, "Why is my girlfriend being so cold to me?" And it turns out that he thinks it's really funny to dump ice water on her as a prank and does this very regularly. A category that sometimes overlaps with that one is high control, involving a relationship where one partner controls the other to an abusive degree, such as limiting their ability to communicate with others, have friends, go places, have access to their finances, or other simple expressions of autonomy. Next is friend-based nastiness, where one partner becomes cruel or otherwise intolerable when in the presence of their friends. An example of this would be, "Am I the asshole for telling my girlfriend that she needs to stop telling her friends I'm kidnapping her?" Where a person's girlfriend keeps telling her plumber buddies that she's been kidnapped anytime she goes and spends the night at his place, and so her friends keep breaking into his house and stomping on all of his Goombas. Together for the kids, when a married couple stays together and miserable for the sake of their children, even though everybody involved would prefer that they just separate. After that is hypothetical conflict, referring to an argument stemming from what one partner said they would do in reaction to a possible future scenario. Like somebody's husband asserting that he'd leave her if she ever got a job. "Where's my ring?" The conflict stems from one partner expecting a marriage proposal and the other partner dragging their feet or not wanting to be married at all. Like when somebody's girlfriend starts having a crisis over the fact that she hasn't been proposed to yet, but the OP isn't willing to disclose to her that he doesn't really want to get married in the first place. On the opposite end of that is rushed relationship, where the conflict stems from one partner thinking that they've taken things too fast or gotten married too soon, like somebody getting married only after 4 months of being together and coming to regret that decision. A very common subcategory is dead bedroom, where the conflict stems from one partner's unwillingness to be physically intimate. This covers a whole spectrum from one partner being physically distant for much longer than the average person would tolerate, to one partner being way over-demanding about their expectations for how often they ought to be intimate. For example, "We haven't done it in 3 days. Is it over for us?" This next subcategory is likely to be diagnosed by the presence of this phrase somewhere in the comments, and that is bangmaid, where one partner only values the other for housework contributions and willingness to have sex. Next is mad with jealousy, which involves one partner being irrationally jealous and territorial, especially for reasons that would never reasonably warrant such jealousy. Like someone wanting their girlfriend to cut off all their online friends because it makes them feel insecure when they talk to somebody that they don't know. Then we've got absent partner, where the conflict stems from one partner's unwillingness to be physically present, like regularly going AWOL or going on a month-long vacation by themselves. For example, a husband being blindsided that his wife wants a divorce after he spent a quarter of the year completely unreachable on a solo backpacking trip. After that is on again, off again, where the couple repeatedly splits and gets back together, especially if they really ought to stay split. And then don't be yourself, where one partner finds the other's hobbies, interests, or behaviors to be completely intolerable. This one comes in two forms: standard, where the audience thinks the partner who's being a hater is the villain, and reverse, where the audience agrees that their partner is really weird. Then there's culture conflict, which stems from the couple being raised in two different cultural backgrounds that don't align as far as what they agree is acceptable and unacceptable. Here's another popular one: unethical polyamory. OP is unhappily in a polyamorous relationship or dragging their unwilling partner into one. This one comes in a lot of flavors, but it's mostly found in the form of two common microcategories. First, the backfire. Partner 1 opens the relationship. Partner 2 gets a lot of action, while Partner 1 does not. Partner 1 wants to close the relationship again. And second, the double standard, where Partner 1 expects to be given much more sexual freedom than Partner 2. Next, uncomfortable age gap, where one half of the couple is much older in a way that's developmentally inappropriate, like a 21-year-old wife and a 40-year-old husband having marital issues. A common addition to this category is FBI, open up. This is when the relationship began when the younger partner was below the age of consent, or the younger partner was groomed into starting a relationship with the older partner as soon as they turned 18. For example, if the contents of that previous post reveal that they've been together 5 years, which would make them 16 and 35 respectively. A subcategory that frequently overlaps with uncomfortable age gap is adulthood, where one partner starts to become disgusted with natural body changes associated with aging. This is also frequently seen in tandem with baby switch-up posts. Then there's ultimatum, where one partner is presented with an ultimatum, especially one between two extremely undesirable options, like you need to never talk to your family ever again or else I'm going to break up with you. What vows? This is when a spouse starts to become withdrawn or wants a divorce after their partner starts to experience some hardships with their health, hits a rough patch in their career, or other issues that are usually accounted for in traditional wedding vows. In sickness and in health? More like in health and mild temporary illness that doesn't affect me too much. Then there's that same trio from the abusive/toxic family category. Retaliatory destruction. For example, am I the asshole because I dug my keys into the side of his pretty little souped up four-wheel drive, carved my name into his legacy? Tantrum thrower, where one or both partners is prone to fits of screaming. And finally, domestic violence. Next category, Angelic OP. Posts where the OP is unrealistically flawless or refuses to disclose any way that they might be in the wrong. Stories that fall into this category always involve at least one other category, because this is more about the framing of the post rather than the nature of the conflict. First in this category is Cruel, Cruel World. This one involves OP being relentlessly tormented despite their unwavering kindness. This subcategory is always type 2. For example, am I the asshole for organizing a cancer research fundraiser, where the OP wants to raise money for cancer research and everyone tells them that it's a stupid, awful idea? And then on the day of the fundraiser, bullies show up and steal every cent of the small amount of money that they raised, and throw tomatoes at them and shove them in their locker. And when the OP goes home and tells their family, they tell him it must be their fault, and then they ground him for a month. Next is obvious omission. The OP is clearly leaving out information that may sway the public opinion against them. This is either type 1 or split down the middle, depending on how well the audience is picking this up. For example, a post that says, "My son refuses to talk to me anymore." And the OP paints the situation as their son just callously and suddenly dropping his parents from their lives one day for absolutely no good reason. And maybe OP disagreed a little bit with his lifestyle, and maybe they just a little bit sent him to a conversion camp to make him straight. But they have no idea why he could possibly be avoiding his parents now. It's a mystery. In obvious omission stories, they tend to either talk around the incriminating portions, only reveal them if pressed in the comments, or just avoid them entirely. And the last of this category is bait and switch, where the title seems to indicate that the OP is obviously in the wrong. But further details reveal that the opposite is actually the case. For example, am I the asshole for crying when my boyfriend bought me a car? The title makes the OP sound really ungrateful and spoiled, right? Seems like a clear-cut YTA? But it turns out that the boyfriend actually wrecked OP's nice new car a little while back, promised to replace it, and ended up cheaping out and buying a barely functional junker when he could have afforded to get the same year, make, and model as the car that he wrecked. Next category, bad pet care. These are posts involving egregiously awful pet care practices, especially ones where the person at fault absolutely refuses to admit that they're in the wrong. First and most upsetting is actively malicious, where the conflict involves a person who is overtly and intentionally cruel to animals in a way that can't be explained by ignorance or unpreparedness. Adjacent to that on the unintentional side is husbandry nightmare, where the pet owner is wildly irresponsible, negligent, ignorant, or unprepared and is almost certainly in denial about this. This may include the pet having been acquired on an impulse buy, the pet being given as a gift without the receiver's prior knowledge. The owner can't afford their pet in absence of unexpected financial difficulty. I did my research on TikTok. Or rehoming their long-term pet for inadequate reasons. Next is non-owner nightmare, which is a lot like husbandry nightmare but involves a non-owner with access to the pets, like a family member, roommate, or house sitter. A common micro-category for this one is it's me or the pet. And with few exceptions, the audience will agree that the OP ought to choose their pet. Then there's pet thief, or posts involving stolen pets. This one most commonly presents itself as two major variants, claiming ownership of an obviously lost pet, or a pet being stolen from an abusive or neglectful owner. After that is captive wild animal, which are posts involving an animal that is unsuited for domestication being kept as a pet. The owner has often paid exorbitant amounts of money to come to own their wild animal, and as such is likely to refuse to acknowledge any feedback about how they ought to probably turn it over to a wildlife rescue. Next, training failure, where the owner refuses to house train or socialize the animal, resulting in destroyed or soiled belongings or extreme misbehavior. For example, my puppy is reactive and it's causing a lot of tension between me and my roommate. And by reactive, they mean my puppy bites the shit out of my roommate anytime they're in the same room as each other. Speaking of, finally, the last one is dangerous pet, where a pet, usually a dog, has a history of harming humans or other pets. Reddit has a particularly strong hang-up against pit bulls, so this one is likely to fall into the micro-category of pit bull bait. Next category, Childfree. Posts involving a person who does not have and does not want children, particularly when they're interacting with parents or children. Because the only thing that Reddit hates more than kids are people, no, let's be honest, women who don't want to have children. First, there's parent critic, where the child-free person is excessively and ignorantly harsh in their judgment towards how people decide to parent their kids. For example, am I the asshole for telling my sister that she needs to try harder to be a good parent? And the thing that the OP is taking issue with is that she doesn't discipline her 3- and 4-year-old children when they're a little noisy when they play. Then there's kid hater, where the child-free person just hates children for existing or for displaying normal child behaviors. Like, am I the asshole for snapping at a kid for getting too close to me? And the OP yelled at and made a little kid cry for the grave crime of standing a little too close in their personal space bubble? On the more extreme end of child-free conflicts is antinatalist, where the conflict stems from the child-free person believing that pregnancy and childbirth is inherently immoral. And because this is Reddit, they can't just keep that opinion to themselves. While Reddit generally loves to make the child-free person into the villain, sometimes that's not the case. Like in the subcategory Change Your Mind. In this, the child-free person is in conflict with a parent who is judgmental about their decision to not have children. Like their own mother begging them repeatedly for grandbabies, even though they've made it very clear several times that they would not like to have kids. Next category, children. Posts where the conflict involves a child or young teen. Sorry, child-free, I had to put the children right next to you. First is devil spawn, or posts where the villainous child seems to be single-mindedly motivated by cruelty and chaos. For example, a post where somebody's nephew was left unattended in their house for about half an hour, and during that time they found a baseball bat, broke the lock to their room, went in, and destroyed all their valuables. Then there's entitled child, where the child is demanding of items that they don't own, attention that they're not owed, or to be allowed in spaces that they're not welcome. The most common version of this is when a kid spots something in someone's house that they'd like to keep for themselves. They ask to keep it or just assume that they could keep it. They get asked to return it by the owner, and then ends up having a big meltdown. This usually involves the child's parent shaming the owner of the item for not willingly giving it up. Speaking of, next is permissive parents, where the parent completely disregards or enables their kid's poor behavior. More often than not, the parent will be equally, if not more, the villain of the story, because frequently the kid will be too young to know better, or making an age-appropriate social error that could be easily corrected by gentle guidance in the right direction. Next is babysitting blowups, or conflicts involving babysitting, including awful babysitters, unreasonable parents, and terrible children. Like, am I the asshole for asking for my money back from the babysitter after she left to go drinking 4 hours before she was supposed to leave? After that is unattended child, where the conflict stems from a child roaming unsupervised, especially if they're seeking out strangers to do things for them that parents usually would. Finally, there's no kids allowed, where the conflict stems from somebody enforcing an adults-only rule at their home or event. Sometimes this looks like a parent wanting to take their child along to a space that is obviously inappropriate or unsafe for kids, and sometimes there's no actual reason to make the space adults only, and so the audience interprets this as excessively authoritarian. Creep. Posts where somebody involved is super creepy. First, why are you running?
Why are you running?
The creepy individual is oblivious that their actions are threatening. For example, am I the asshole for being offended when a woman moved after I sat next to her on the bus? And it turns out that the bus was otherwise completely empty, and the OP moved again to confront this woman after she moved. This also sometimes presents as unaware stalker, or when the person is oblivious that their actions have crossed over the boundary from curiosity to stalking. Next is person of authority. This is when a person with authoritative status, like a teacher or a boss, is pursuing somebody that they have power over and is usually in denial that this is a problem. For example, a post titled, "Is it inappropriate for me, 53M, to pursue my younger coworker, 28F?" And just on its face, the answer is probably yes, but the details of the post reveal that the OP isn't just her coworker, he's her boss. He has firing power over her, and the younger person is clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but only puts up with it out of fear of losing her job. Related but separate is workplace creep, where a person in a corporate or customer service setting interprets workplace cordiality or good customer service as flirtation, or otherwise becomes obsessed with a coworker, employee, or customer. Then there's creepy relative, where a relative is demonstrating inappropriate or boundary-violating behavior. And then there's predator, where the person is a creep because the person they're attracted to is a minor or inappropriately young. Sometimes the OP is the creep in this scenario, but it's more likely for the OP to be the person they're creeping on. Finally, there's attitude flip, where the creepy person's demeanor switches from affectionate to aggressive after they realize that the person they're hitting on isn't interested. For example, a post that would be both this and workplace creep would be if somebody turned down their coworker asking them out and it resulted in that person trying to sabotage their job and get them fired. Next category, death. Posts involving death or impending death. The most common type of death category that I tend to see is the inheritance dispute. Issues involving inheritance or that pertain to a dead or dying person's last will and testament. This one has two particularly common microcategories. The first is grave robbers, or people who are not due to receive inheritance trying to take it away from the people who are. Like if a widow's late husband was an exceptionally skilled painter, and his personal collection of paintings was left to her in his will. But now her in-laws are trying to convince her to give them that collection just because they want to sell it off and make a profit. Then there's the Black Widow. Stories involving a sudden end-of-life redirection of an inheritance, usually to a partner or spouse, especially if that spouse is much younger or new, like somebody's son being told that he was due to receive half of his father's estate. Except during his father's final days, when his advanced dementia was making him severely confused, somehow he ended up signing over 100% of his estate to his 29-year-old wife of 1 year. Next up is evil and dying. Stories involving a dying abusive parent, relative, or other former loved one expecting to reconnect with or be cared for by the people they've hurt. Like if a mom horrifically mistreated her son during his childhood, and then became completely absent in his adulthood and assumed that he would just show up to take care of her after she was diagnosed with a terminal illness. This next one's always a favorite. Dying ex. An ex-partner expects to reconnect with their former lover when they're dying, especially if that person's current partner is upset by this. The dying ex's requests usually involve that they need to meet one-on-one and face-to-face with no elaboration on why it has to be that way, and may involve long-distance travel to do so. Then there's entitled to the dying, where people who had been previously cut off by their dying relative or friend expect to come back into their lives just as they're dying. This one has a lot of overlap with inheritance issues because this person often comes back into the dying person's life with the expectation of being added to their will. Next is destroyed memento, or a conflict involving a precious memento of a dead loved one being destroyed, stolen, or ruined either out of an act of maliciousness or just as an accident. Like a post where somebody gets in a fight with their boyfriend that results in him tearing up the 30-plus-year-old houseplants that they inherited from their grandma so severely that they can't be saved. The final one in this category is last wishes ignored, which involves the surviving friend or relative refusing to honor a dying person's last wishes. This is either because they would be difficult or impossible to follow through on, or just because of laziness, negligence, or lack of respect. For example, somebody choosing to ignore their wife's last wishes to have their ashes scattered at Disney World, because they know about how the staff will just unceremoniously vacuum it up and throw them out. Next category, divorce. Posts involving currently divorced or separated couples, or couples who are in the process of divorcing. Let's start with the two big ones. First, custody struggle. Posts involving custody battles or issues with co-parenting. Like people being upset about their amount of allotted time with their kids, or being upset about being given no custody, or two divorced parents having completely different expectations about how their kids should be raised. Sometimes this ends up devolving into kidnapping, where one divorced parent takes the kids and disappears without permission. Like somebody posting, "Am I the asshole for taking my kids on vacation without asking first?" But what they actually did was skip town on the day that the other parent was supposed to get the kids for a few weeks. And they did this without telling them or anybody and ended up triggering an Amber Alert. The second big one is asset struggle, or posts involving a disagreement about who is entitled to the money or items that previously belonged to the shared household. Like somebody insisting that he's entitled to get the whole Beanie Baby collection, but his bitch of an ex-wife insists that she should get the Beanie Babies. A related subcategory is she took it all, or posts where one partner, usually the wife, financially ruins the other during separation of assets or via alimony and child support. Like a post titled, "She took the whole Beanie Baby collection. I'm ruined." Then there's deadbeat, where one divorced parent is way less involved or completely absent from their child's lives. This is linked to the micro-category entitled deadbeat, where the deadbeat parent is upset that they don't receive the same kind of privileges or treatment as the more active parent. Like a deadbeat dad visiting his young adult daughter who he only sees once a year or less, and getting angry that she has pictures of her other parent and stepdad on the walls of her house but not him. After that is Disney dad / Disney mom, where one half of the couple is doting, generous to the point of spoiling, and extremely permissive with their kids, leaving the children resentful of the other half who has to bear the brunt of important parenting tasks like discipline and teaching responsible behavior. Then there's communication via child, where a separated couple refuses to communicate directly to each other, instead using their child as a proxy. Then poisoning the well, where one or both parents is dead set on making their children believe that the other parent is a horrible, awful person. Like if a couple got divorced due to one of them persistently having issues with infidelity, but the one who got cheated on chooses not to disclose that for the sake of not making the divorce any worse on their kids. But it turns out the one who's been cheating has been telling their kids that they were the one who got cheated on, therefore turning their kids against the non-cheating parent and making it difficult or impossible for them to admit the truth. Lastly, there's child of divorce, where the conflict involves a child's reaction to their parents getting divorced. Sometimes this has to do with the kid acting out due to the stress that the divorce is causing them. Other times it's the opposite. Like a post titled, "Am I the asshole for saying okay, cool when my parents told me that they were getting divorced?" Next category, drugs and alcohol. First up is addict behaviors, where the conflict involves damaging behavior associated with substance addiction, like theft, dishonesty, frequent disappearance, or being unable to get or hold a job. For example, a post titled, "Am I the asshole for borrowing cash from my mom to pay back my friend?" But they're not actually borrowing the cash, they're just stealing it, and their friend is actually their dealer who's threatening to bust their kneecaps. Then there's addict in denial, where a person with a substance abuse issue refuses to acknowledge that it's an issue and gets mad at others for showing concern or trying to stop them from using. Next is DUI, where the substance user is high or drunk while operating heavy machinery. Sometimes the OP is trying to defend their intoxicated driving, but more often the OP is the other people who are subjected to it. Then there's on death's door, where the conflict involves a person who is at high risk of lethal overdose, or an addict whose health has been destroyed by their habit but refuses to quit. When the substance user becomes sober, sometimes you'll get a recovery struggle, where the recovered addict is in conflict with somebody whose behavior is triggering them, is failing to abstain from behaviors that could lead to relapse, or is demanding forgiveness from somebody they hurt during their active addiction, as in a misunderstanding of the making amends step in a 12-step program. While the substance user is usually the villain in the drugs and alcohol category, recovery struggle, the other people around them are much more likely to be the villain. After an unsuccessful recovery struggle, you may get a relapse, where the substance abuser begins using again, much to the distress and inconvenience of the other people in their lives. Like a post where a drug user's mom skips out on her daughter's wedding to attend to her recently relapsed son, who has a habit of doing this kind of thing during his siblings' important pre-scheduled events. Next is snitch, where a person's drug use is exposed to their parents, their parole officer, or the police. Audiences are usually aggressively against the snitch character for less harmful drugs like weed or LSD, and relatively more likely to be in their favor for more potentially dangerous drugs. Then there's enabler, where somebody is covering for or funding a drug user's habit. Like a post where somebody's been covertly giving their sibling large amounts of money intermittently for years, knowing that the sibling is going to spend most of it, if not all of it, on their addiction, and has been hiding the fact that they're doing that from their husband. While most of the drugs categories involve drug users, there are also some that don't, or at least less directly. Like false accusation, when somebody is being accused of being on drugs when they aren't. Another one is peer pressure, where a non-drug user is being pressured into taking drugs or to stay in the company of people who are on drugs. Like if somebody took psychedelics right before their friend showed up, assuming they'd be able to be coerced into trip sitting, but when the friend got there, they said no thanks and left. The final drugs category is teetotaler, where the conflict involves a strictly sober person enforcing boundaries on other people's substance use that may or may not be overreaching. Like the boundary may be totally reasonable, like not wanting them to smoke inside their house. Or it might be kind of out of line, like forbidding their guest from taking CBD gummies to help with their chronic pain. Next category, fetish bait. The author's barely disguised fetish. This can technically account for any type of perversion known to man, but on Reddit specifically, I find that it tends to come in two varieties. Number 1, cuckbait, or posts written to covertly express a kink for being cheated on. And number 2, bait. Posts that hint at or directly describe an inappropriately intimate relationship with a sibling, parent, cousin, or other family, especially one that is mutually consensual and not portrayed as abusive. Examples withheld because no thank you. Next category, financial fumbles. Posts that involve extreme financial mishandling or fraud. First up, can't afford necessities. Or posts involving conflict where one person is unable to afford important costs like food, housing, utilities, or education, especially if they would have been able to afford those things if they had cut out reckless spending. Like a post where somebody's asking for help because they ended up spending all of this month's rent money on a mobile game. After that is impulse buy, where a lot of money is spent on something useless, frivolous, or temporary, especially if they can't afford it or there are more important financial priorities. Like if a family with 5 kids needs a new car to be able to transport everyone all at once, and the husband unilaterally decides to get a 2-seater Lamborghini, leaving them too broke to even get an old used minivan. Next is no fair trades. This one involves the villain of the story refusing a fair trade for something that they're begging for, or the villain proposes an extremely unreasonable trade. For example, am I the asshole for saying that I'll only pay my sister's rent on the condition that she takes over babysitting for a few weeks? Depending on the details of that post, that one can go either way. Maybe what the OP is asking for is about $200 worth of babysitting compared to $1,000 worth of rent. Or maybe the OP is expecting their sister to take time off from their job and become a full-time live-in nanny, raising the cost of that labor to well beyond that $1,000 for rent and leaving her even more financially in the pit because she's missing so much work. Then there's overgenerous, where a person in a precarious financial situation keeps giving their money away. Like if the OP's mom wasn't able to pay her utility bill that month because she gave all her money away to the church. Up next, spoiled child, where the villain is greedy and extremely reliant on their parents. Like if the OP wanted a $60,000 car and threw a fit because her parents only got her a $30,000 car. A micro category of that one is the spoiled sibling, where the spoiled child character is the sibling of the point of view character. The reverse dynamic of spoiled child is spoiled parent. This is when the villain is greedy and extremely reliant on their adult child. Like parents who insist that so long as their adult child lives at home, they're entitled to access 100% of his paycheck, which then prevents him from saving enough money to move out. Next is serial borrower, where the subject of the post routinely asks for loans or borrows money without ever paying them back. This also applies to borrowed items, especially if those items are lost, ruined, or never returned. Then there's straight up crime, where the villain's financial fumble is legally actionable, like theft, burglary, or credit card fraud. like a post asking if it's really so bad that the OP took out several credit cards in the new baby's name. Next is, hey girl! The subject of the story is peddling a multi-level marketing scheme. For example, a post where somebody walks out on a dinner with their old friend because they thought they would just be catching up, but the real reason they were invited in the first place is because the friend wanted to try to get them on their Amway downline. And finally, to the moon? Where the subject of the story has made a huge investment in highly volatile markets like stocks or cryptocurrency, especially one that they can't afford to lose. Like somebody realizing just now that Beanie Babies weren't a great investment, and they've spent all of their savings on them and spent so much money on a good lawyer to ensure that they get the Beanie Baby collection in the divorce. Next category, incel bait. Posts intended to encourage misogyny, or less often hatred for the socially well-off and conventionally attractive. Let's start with gold-digging whores, or posts where the woman is clearly only in a relationship for the financial gain. Like a post where someone's new girlfriend gets asked to pay for things occasionally and he gets ghosted as a result. Then there's Left Me for Chad, where a woman leaves her original partner for a man who is some combination of more conventionally attractive, richer, or of a higher social status. Like a sob story about how a guy threw away his dreams to become the perfect man that his wife wanted, only for her to run off with a 20-something Instagram model. Next up, divorce cell, or posts about divorce that have a decidedly misogynistic tone. To be clear, I'm not saying that every post that points out inequitable treatment of men in divorce court is meant to be misogynistic, but you need to remember that a lot of these posts aren't written by men going through a divorce. They're written by young men who've never had a long-term relationship in their lives because they think that feminism is an evil Illuminati conspiracy to keep men subjugated. Next, sex vending machine broke. Or posts where a man isn't rewarded with sex or a relationship despite doing everything right. After that is Beat It Chick, where a woman rejects a man and unsuccessfully attempts to win back his attention later after he becomes rich or successful. Bonus points if he mockingly points out how she's gained weight or become unsuccessful in her career or is a single mother or doesn't look like a 15-year-old anymore. There's Evil Sex Worker, or posts that demonize sex workers, almost exclusively women, usually portraying them as greedy money grubbers who will do anything for a quick buck. Next is High Body Count, or posts that are made to fearmonger women's sexual autonomy or imply that a woman having several previous partners is a deep personal failing, especially if that same standard is not held to the men in the story. Like a post where somebody throws his girlfriend's belongings out of his apartment when she described her amount of previous partners as too many to remember. Then there's Baby Trap, or posts where the biological father of a child is someone other than the man who the mother was in a long-term relationship with, especially if this information was withheld for many years, and especially if the mother knew all along. Like a post where someone learns that the 16-year-old that they've been raising isn't their biological son and wants to be validated for his decision to withdraw all support and never see him again. Finally, there's high school revenge fantasy, where a grown-up, archetypical high school popular kid is now struggling financially, struggling with romance, failing in their career, becoming unattractive, whatever, and now the person that they looked down on back in high school gets to gloat. Next category, infidelity. Posts involving cheating. Posts in the infidelity category are more likely than most to be multi-parters. In the first post, the OP is usually uncertain or unaware that their partner is cheating, and this ends up becoming revealed through a series of events after the fact. The first is a fun one, surprised at obvious consequences. The cheater was caught and is shocked and horrified to find out that their partner doesn't want to be with them anymore or doesn't trust them. With basically no exceptions, the audience is not on the cheating partner's side in these conflicts, even on subreddits like r/adultery, where the target audience is other people who cheat. Next, projection. Partner 1 has extremely low trust in Partner 2 and constantly accuses them of cheating, only for it to turn out that Partner 1 was the one who was cheating. For example, a post that's initially about somebody's girlfriend having a bad habit of going through their phone to check for cheating. But then the OP, at the encouragement of commenters, ends up going through the girlfriend's phone and finding that she's had several side pieces for their entire relationship. Then there's suspicious friend, where one partner has a close friendship that the other partner suspects might be an affair. For example, a post titled, "My wife goes out one-on-one with her male coworker at least once a week. Am I right to be concerned?" This could go one of two ways. The first variant is justified. The partner and the close friend are in fact revealed to be having an affair. And then there's unjustified, where the accusing partner is wrong and overreacting to normal friendship behaviors. A similar subcategory is Suspicious X, where one partner has connections to a previous relationship that's causing the other partner to suspect infidelity. To round out the suspicious trio, we've got Suspicious Vacation, One partner goes on vacation alone or only with friends, leaving their partner to suspect that they may have cheated or gone to visit a long-distance lover. Again, this one might turn out either justified or unjustified. Next is dating app or posts where the cheating partner is exposed by being active on a dating or hookup app. Like a post where a wife and husband are having dinner when all of a sudden the wife hears a and she's like, "Honey, what was that?" And he's like, "Oh, my job made us download a new app this week. Somebody must have just posted an announcement." But hold TF on, because the wife has gay friends, so she knows what that little means. And so, next, burner phone. The cheating partner attempts to conceal their infidelity with a secret phone or laptop, which is then discovered. Like if somebody's husband all of a sudden starts spending a lot of time on his work laptop. And this is a person who has always been very vocal about his unwillingness to do extra work off the clock. And one thing leads to another, and in the update post, the wife lets us know that he's been using that laptop for e-dating. Then there's sex worker, where one partner cheats by paying for a sex worker. Like a post where somebody notices that their husband has been sending $600 via Cash App several times per month. On a similar note is clashing values, where one partner thinks that certain no-contact actions like looking at or interacting with bikini models' posts on Instagram is cheating, but the other does not. Then we've got, but it was true love, where the cheater insists that their infidelity isn't morally wrong because they're deeply in love with their affair partner. Sometimes with that one you'll also find like your mom but better, where the post-separation cheater doesn't understand why their kids won't accept their affair partner as a new member of their family. For example, a dad getting angry with his children that they refuse to call his affair partner turned second wife mom. A fun and slightly rare one is it's coming from inside the house, where the person is cheating with someone from their partner's family or close friends. Like a post where someone's boyfriend and her mom are really buddy-buddy to the point where it's kind of weird. Like they touch each other way more often than you ought to touch the mom of the person you're dating. And then it turns out that they're having a full-on affair behind OP's back. Next, cheating for me but not for thee, where the cheater becomes distraught that they are being cheated on either by their current partner or by their affair partner. Like someone drops a post with the title, "I found out that my wife is having an affair and I'm devastated." And they kind of talk around the fact but eventually reveal in the comments that he's had multiple affairs spanning for basically their entire marriage and the wife knew the whole time. Then there's "this is our little secret," where a cheating person's friend or family member knows about the affair and the cheating person expects them to keep quiet about it. Like a kid finding out about their dad's affair and the dad insisting that it needs to stay between the two of them and the kid deciding to tell their mom anyways. After that is revenge fantasy, or an infidelity story that results in the cheater facing some kind of dramatic comeuppance. For example, the OP finds out that her boyfriend has a secret wife, and so she cinematically tosses all of his belongings out of her apartment from the third-story window. The last one in the infidelity category is forced DNA test, which is distinct from surprise DNA results because the test was compelled by a suspicious partner rather than taken voluntarily. Yet again, this one usually follows two specific routes. Justified, where the DNA results reveal a different biological father than the one who ordered the DNA test. Or unjustified, where the test demander is the biological father and the family is usually destroyed from lack of trust afterwards and may result in a breakup, divorce, or termination of the pregnancy. Next category. In-laws. Posts involving conflict with the OP's family-in-law. Let's start with "they won't leave," or posts where the in-laws have poor boundaries and are constantly asserting themselves into the couple's personal space whether they want them there or not. Then there's mama's boy, or posts where one spouse is over-reliant on and constantly siding with their toxic parent. For example, a new mother is constantly getting into arguments with her mother-in-law about how she's choosing to care for her baby. And every time this happens, the husband either doesn't defend his wife or takes his mother's side, even though when she's not present, he doesn't seem to share any of her concerns. Next is marriage isn't family, where the in-laws, especially parents, don't consider family by marriage to be actual family, and so they exclude their in-laws from important things like holiday events or important information that the rest of the family receives. How about substitute parent/child? An in-law parent or child assumes that their in-law relationship is equal in closeness and obligation as their own children or parents. For example, somebody's daughter-in-law pitching a fit because they won't pay for her college like they did for their son. Then there's jealousy, or a conflict involving in-laws who are covetous over something that their in-law family has, especially if the in-laws shame them for having it or attempt to steal it. Like if the in-laws are constantly making snide comments about that they have a pool as if it's some kind of beacon of decadence while also expecting to be allowed to use it anytime they want. The last in this category is tug of war, where two sets of in-laws are in conflict with each other about their level of attention and amount of time they get with their shared family, like access to grandkids. For example, a post where a grandma is really upset that she doesn't get to babysit as often as the other set of grandparents. And there usually has to be some kind of major buried lead about why that is, like she allowed the kids to smoke a cigarette or something. Intermission. How to write a good bait story. So perhaps this video has gotten you wanting to write some fake stories of your own. But how do you keep your stories from dropping into the lower believability tiers like M and BS? It's a lot less fun when everybody on the post is just telling you how fake it sounds, and less enjoyable for the readers if they can't suspend their disbelief. Therefore, I would like to offer my top 5 tips for writing a believable fake Reddit story. Number 1. Assholes hardly ever understand that they are being assholes, much less assholes who are posting on AmITheAsshole. Therefore, when you're writing a story with an asshole OP, you need to avoid demonstrating a clear understanding of why your prospective character is the asshole. That means, don't overtly express that you understand why the other person is upset with the OP. Let their assholery be made evident through your description of the conflict. Don't use language that gives away that the POV character knows that they're in the wrong. For example, disagreeing with is a more neutral descriptor than attacking, and convincing is more neutral than guilting. Don't admit to something a real asshole would never own up to. For example, if you're writing a story in the bad pet care husbandry nightmare category, you don't want to just come out and say, I've been neglecting my pet. You want to couch it in an excuse, like, I've been a bit too occupied to give my pet a lot of attention lately. Don't write the asshole to be cartoonishly unlikable. Even the nastiest people tend to understand how to flatteringly portray themselves when they're trying to get a bunch of internet strangers on their side. Their assholery should be clear without them having to make snide jabs at the person they're in conflict with. For example, a person who hates dogs would probably realize that hating dogs is an unpopular trait to have. And so they wouldn't just start openly insulting dogs in their post unless they're posting on r/dogfree. 2. Write what you know. If you don't know anything about how prenuptial agreements work, don't write a prenup into your story, or else you're probably going to end up describing something that wouldn't exist in real life. Use details from your own lived experience to make your conflict feel more vivid and realistic. 3. Don't derail your conflict with severely unrealistic details. For example, in a case where OP is obviously in the right, would a total stranger who is only a witness to the conflict really take them aside and yell at them for being so awful? Or would every single one of somebody's friends think they're in the wrong when they talk to them about it later? Remember to make the hero, villain, and side characters react to things in a way that's grounded in reality. 4. Consider the realism of your writing voice. If you consider yourself to be a good writer, sometimes your standard writing voice is going to be inappropriate for a bait post. If your prospective character is obviously very stupid, maybe they shouldn't be writing with perfect grammar and spelling. Or the opposite, if your POV character is meant to be wealthy and well-educated, but you personally struggle with grammar and spelling, maybe run that post through a grammar checker before you hit submit. Also, use restraint with your amount of specifically quoted dialogue. People don't usually remember the exact wording that other people and even themselves used in earlier conversation, and so the conflict shouldn't be written out in full quotes like it's a screenplay. And 5, reference the subcategories on this list to avoid falling into overdone tropes. If your post clearly falls into a single subcategory, and especially a microcategory, it has been done to death so much that it's no longer interesting. Taking from multiple subcategories, or even coming up with a conflict that avoids them entirely, is much more likely to result in a story that feels fresh and unique. The best example of this that I've seen lately is a post titled, "Am I the asshole for snapping at my girlfriend? She made ChatGPT write a rap about my cat dying of cancer." The summary of this one is that the OP had a cat named Sissy, who recently passed away from bowel cancer, and their girlfriend attempts to make light of the situation by generating goofy rap lyrics about it with ChatGPT. This culminates in, quote, her asking the AI to write her a rap where she gave Sissy poop cancer on purpose to kill her, and singing at me lines like, "Poop cancer, yeah, we did it with spite. Sissy's gone now, and it just feels right." This post has everything. A genuinely upsetting backdrop of grief, somebody derailing their relationship with ChatGPT, that's fresh, that's original, that's on trend. The fact that it's horrific and cruel if you assume that it's real, and hilarious if you assume that it's fake, it's somewhere in the abusive/toxic relationship category, but can't be neatly described by any of the subcategories, but nor does it have to, because I've never seen a post anything like this. It's so absurd that I have to assume that it's fiction, but it's type R anyways because not a single one of the 1,000+ comments called it out as fake. Assuming that it is fictional, this, my friend, is top-tier bait, so pour one out for this post because it's been removed for providing too much supplementary information in the comments. And now back to the categories. You good? Take a break if you need to. When's the last time you drank some water? For me, it's about 3 seconds ago. And that could be you. Next category, multi-parters. This one's another story structure category where the bait plays out over the course of several posts. First and most common is the single update, or stories with one main post and one update, especially an update that severely changes the context of the original post. People love a plot twist. Along that line, there's also the double update, and sometimes the triple update. Any more than that, and you're entering the territory of our next subcategory, the long haul. Multi-parters that are long, detailed, and have serialized updates over the course of several months or even years. These are usually a fun read, but have a tendency to get less and less plausible as the story plays out, because the writer often trades in their restraint for clickability. Sometimes with these multi-part stories, you'll end up with a rush job, or stories where the updates appear too quickly for the events of the post to have possibly happened. A very common version of this are legal battles that play out over the course of a couple days, as opposed to the more realistic several months. Rush job posts are inherently type BS. And then, my absolute favorite of the multi-parter category, and quite possibly my favorite subcategory out of this entire list, player to start. This is when the person who the original post is written about finds that post and joins in on the discourse. This either vindicates the OP or reverses the course of public opinion. I seriously love it when I find one of these. They are so brazenly fake every single time. And it's especially funny when they start having an argument with each other in the comment section, as if they're not entirely the same person using 2 different accounts. Next category, neighbors and housing. Posts about conflicts with neighbors or conflicts involving real estate. Let's begin with unsuited for apartment life. Or posts where the villain is unable to cope with the obvious realities of apartment living, like reasonable amount of noise coming from shared walls, crying or playing children, being able to hear footsteps, like somebody who calls the cops on their neighbor because their colicky baby was crying for a few hours. Then there's the bad apple. Not that one. Posts where one resident in a neighborhood or apartment complex is universally despised by everyone else, especially when all the others have a neutral or positive relationship. If it's not just one person, then it might just be a tough neighborhood, where the OP lives in a dangerous part of town with neighbors that are regularly engaging in disruptive, erratic, or illegal activities. HOAs are a favorite hot topic on Reddit, so the next one is HOA bait, or posts with a disruptive nightmare neighbor who can't be controlled due to the lack of an HOA. Basically like pro-HOA propaganda. Like posts where somebody has a TikTok content house neighbor who hosts loud parties every single night and they'd never change no matter how many times the cops get called on them. More common is anti-HOA bait, or posts about overbearing, power-tripping HOAs. Like a post where someone's HOA is forbidding them from growing tomatoes in a container garden because they think it looks too much like pot. Next is the landlord special, or posts about awful living conditions caused by a negligent or abusive landlord. For example, a post titled, "My landlord deleted all the ladders in the pool when we were inside and now we're probably going to die?" On the flip side of that, for landlords and landlord sympathizers, we've got the tenant special, or posts about horrible tenants where OP is their landlord. For example, "My dumbass tenants lit the place on fire even though I gave them top-of-the-line appliances." Then there's destruction of property, where the conflict involves property being destroyed, vandalized, or otherwise being made unusable. Like when a neighbor's kids end up destroying the liner of the OP's above-ground pool when they were using it without their permission. A post with that setup would also fall under invasive neighbors, where the conflict is about neighbors who regularly trespass, invite themselves over, or treat neighboring lawns as communal space. Survey says, landowner neighbors are in a dispute over where their property line is. An example post would be, am I the asshole for building my fence slightly onto my neighbor's property? And by slightly, they mean 6 feet under their property. Related to that is a Reddit favorite, tree law! Or posts where neighbors cut down or cause damage to a tree that they did not have legal authority to do so. At least in the United States, you can be hit with massive fines for cutting down or damaging a tree that doesn't belong to you. And people on Reddit love the concept of a tree and generally hate other humans, so it's just a match made in heaven. For example, a post where the OP claimed to have trimmed some branches that were overhanging his property, and by that he means cutting off nearly half of a big old oak tree in a total hack job that'll never grow back correctly. The last in this category is squatters' wrongs, where the conflict involves a person who is living in a place that they're not entitled to by means of non-payment, lack of permission, or general lack of legal right to the property. Bonus points if it's a big surprise that they were living there in the first place. Next category, paranoia. Conflicts that are rooted in paranoid thinking, especially if it's unjustified. First, the internet cannot get enough of this one, trafficking paranoia. Conflicts where someone is convinced that someone was trying to sell them into human trafficking. For example, an AMA, that stands for Ask Me Anything, where somebody claims that they nearly fell victim to human traffickers. Except the situation that they describe sounds a lot more like those people were after their money than trying to kidnap them. Then there's stranger danger, or posts involving fear of strangers who are behaving in ways that are not legitimately threatening. Like somebody who starts screaming and panicking when somebody stares at them for a little too long on public transit. Next is fearful bigot, where the paranoia involves some aspect of racism, LGBTQ phobia, classism, or other bigotry. Usually also classified under unreasonable majority or unreasonable minority, depending on who the audience decides is the villain. We'll get to those near the end of this video. For example, a post where a mom forces her kid to switch classes mid-year because she panicked after learning that her teacher is gay. Last in paranoia is scary substance, or an unjustified paranoia involving somebody's consumption of drugs or alcohol, like assuming somebody's an addict for rare and benign substance use, or misguided assumptions about substances that pose little or no harm to the user. When the fear is justified, that goes in the drugs and alcohol category. Next category, pop psych narcissism. This one's a Reddit favorite. Posts involving the pop psych understanding of narcissistic family and relationship dynamics and all of its related buzzwords. I say pop psych because the Reddit understanding of narcissistic personality disorder is related to the clinical understanding, but is also often entirely separate from it, and has a tendency of lumping every single person with abusive tendencies under the narcissist umbrella. This category sets itself apart from the abusive/toxic family and relationship categories due to the presence of common buzzwords in the comments. The first is no contact bait, or posts where the obvious solution is to cut contact with a problematic individual or reduce contact to an absolute minimum. If you repeatedly see the phrase, "you should go NC" in the comments, that's no contact bait. Next is no contact evasion, or posts where a person who has been cut off is trying to reassert themselves back into the life of the person who cut them off. Like the OP moves 1,000 miles away to get away from their toxic family, only for them to move in down the street just about a year later. Then there's flying monkeys, or posts where the villainous family member is being aggressively defended by everyone other than OP, especially if OP seems to be literally the only person who has a problem with how they behave. If a post ends with, "everybody's blowing up my phone telling me how I'm an awful person," or something along those lines, that's probably going to be flying monkeys. Then there's the golden child, which has a lot of overlap with the favorite child category of abusive/toxic family, but is usually distinguished by the favored child being forgiving of or ignorant to their parents' toxic behavior just because they're not receiving the bulk of the mistreatment. On the opposite end of that is the scapegoat, where one child is treated significantly worse than the others. For example, if parents remember to get Christmas presents for all of their children except for one. Next is emotional incest, where somebody is forced to fill a role over their parent or sibling that would be more reasonable to be filled by a partner or spouse, like a boy mom who keeps sabotaging her son's relationships because they make her jealous. Last in this category is love bombing, or posts involving the abuse tactic where the abusive person heaps kindness and generosity onto their victim just to hold it over their heads at a later point. For example, a person's husband severely wrongs them in some way, and then apologizes by getting a bouquet of 100 red roses as a substitute for doing anything to change his behavior going forward. Next category, pregnancy. posts involving pregnancy, fertility, or family planning issues. First, we've got childless and scorned. An infertile or otherwise childless woman is extremely triggered by the mention of pregnancy or learning that other people in her life are pregnant. Like a person who ends a long-standing friendship over their immense jealousy over the fact that their friend is having a baby. Then there's unreasonable pregnant, or posts where the pregnant person is antisocial, overly demanding, or diagnosably psychotic. The reverse of that is unreasonable impregnator, where the conflict involves the non-pregnant partner being overdemanding, unaccommodating, or generally unsupportive of their partner who is pregnant. For example, a wife who was the sole housekeeper before she got pregnant being expected to do just as many chores during her third trimester. Next is substance abuser, or posts where the pregnant person refuses to stop taking substances that could harm the baby. For example, am I the asshole for saying that it's not anybody's business but mine that I smoke cigarettes to cope with my pregnancy? Yet another Reddit favorite is name shaming, where the name of the baby is the source of the conflict. This typically results in one of two outcomes. More commonly is that the audience consensus is that the people disapproving of the name are being rude and overdramatic. However, sometimes the opposite happens and the audience agrees that under no circumstances should the baby be given the stated name. A somewhat common micro-category of name shaming is name poaching, where an expecting couple, intentionally or accidentally, uses a name that a close friend or relative was already intending to use. Last up in pregnancy is temper reveal, or an unreasonable reaction to the gender of the baby or issues related to a gender reveal party. Like somebody who throws a big gender reveal knowing full well that they will be extremely upset if the fetus is a girl. And then they are, much to everyone's embarrassment. Next category, religion. Posts where the conflict is religious in nature. Probably the most common religion conflict is your beliefs, not mine, where a person tries to enforce the beliefs or morality of their religion onto a person who does not follow that religion. For example, somebody's in a relationship with a Mormon boy who's trying to convert her, and so he ends up throwing out all of her coffee. Next is proselytizer, where the conflict involves somebody who is aggressive and insistent about converting another person to their religion. This includes any conflict with a street preacher or door-to-door missionary. On a similar vein to that is child conversion, where the conflict involves somebody who's attempting to convert a child to their religion without their parents' permission, or a child being successfully converted to a faith that their parents don't follow. One that I personally think is underutilized is cultist, where the religious person belongs to a cult or a cult-like sect of a larger religion. Like somebody deciding to cut and run after they realized that the personality test they signed themselves up for was actually a pitch for Scientology. Then there's interfaith relationship, where the conflict stems from a couple belonging to two different religions, or one half is an atheist and the other religious. For example, am I the asshole because I told my husband that I'll be sad when he goes to hell? Next up is hypocrite, where the religious person is acting in a way that is contrary to their stated beliefs, especially ones regarding kindness, generosity, and compassion. While the rage target is typically the religious person on Reddit, there is also the unreasonable atheist, where an atheist person is overzealous in their anti-religiousness and attempts to suppress others' religious practices that don't personally affect them. Like somebody insisting that their guests aren't allowed to wear any type of religious head covering into their home. But because this is Reddit, there's also heroic atheist, which is basically indistinguishable from unreasonable atheist, except that the reader's consensus is that the atheist is in the right. Next category, rude, also known as assholery not otherwise specified, or anus. This category is a catch-all for posts involving rudeness or abusive behavior that cannot be sorted into any other category. These conflicts may involve a family or couple if that relationship connection is less relevant. First up, abandoned, or a conflict where one person ends up ditching the other. This one has two micro-categories, the first being bar-bi, where one person ditches somebody at a party, bar, nightclub, because they either found people that they prefer the company of or somebody to hook up with. The second is stranded, where a person is abandoned on vacation, often leaving them with no form of transportation very far from home. And you'd think the person who abandoned them would usually be the villain in these types of posts, but you'd be surprised. Next is no returned favors, where a person refuses to assist somebody who helped them in the past, despite having the means to do so. Alternately, it could be kind of a revenge thing, where the person who was refused help gets to refuse that person in the future. A common form of general assholery is excessively critical, where a person is being overly judgmental in a matter that's none of their business, especially if they have no expertise in what they're criticizing. Then there's boundary violators, or posts involving people who assert themselves into others' lives where they weren't welcomed. This includes the micro-category self-invited, involving people who show up to events, particularly RSVP-only events, uninvited. Then there's a give an inch, take a mile, where a person who's shown one voluntary act of kindness starts becoming demanding of larger and more burdensome acts of kindness. For example, somebody lets their coworker vent to them once, and now that coworker starts complaining about their problems every single time they interact. Then we've got backstabber, where a person does something with a deliberate or possibly negligent intent to hurt or betray. For example, somebody throws a party to commemorate getting their PhD, and then their sister ends up getting engaged during that party and completely overshadowing that whole celebration. Next is overreaction, where the villain massively overreacts to a person's benign comment, joke, or generally inoffensive behavior. This subcategory also includes fabricated problem, where one person was just looking for something to get angry about. Then there's last minute, involving a sudden cancellation or change of schedule, especially one that could have been avoided with more considerate planning. Then lousy gifter/giftee, involving an inconsiderate gift, somebody thinking that they haven't received the proper gratitude for a gift, someone being extremely ungrateful for an excellent gift, or somebody being upset about not receiving a specific gift. Next up, pants on fire, where the post involves a lie or a habit of compulsive lying, like a post where somebody's friend has been lying about having cancer. Withheld information, where the conflict involves information that was withheld from the conflicting party. That information could be a pretty severe lie by omission, or it could just be none of their business. An example of that former version would be somebody failing to let their son know that he's at risk of a severe degenerative disease. Next is common sense deficiency, where the conflict stems from somebody making a choice that any external observer can tell is obviously ill-advised. Like buying a big fancy house under the assumption that they're about to be promoted, and oops, they aren't, and now they can't afford the mortgage. Then there's leopards ate my face, where a person is surprised at the obvious consequences to their actions. The name of this one stems from a Twitter post by Adrian Bott that reads, "I never thought leopards would eat my face," sobs woman who voted for the leopards eating people's faces party. Like a post where a mom refuses to follow the generally accepted guidelines for when to teach her kid how to read, and now her daughter is 10 and she can't read or write. Next is you're embarrassing me, where a person does something that another person finds humiliating by association. For example, somebody walking out on a first date because the other person started being rude to the waitstaff. Next, doxing, where the conflict involves somebody sharing personal information about somebody else, like their address or phone number, either as a means of revenge or due to general maliciousness. Then we've got flake, which involves a person not following through on their promised commitment. Like somebody planning an elaborate date night to celebrate their first year of dating, only for the other person to cancel and go out with their friends instead. Next is therapist issues, where somebody has an unprofessional, ineffective, or abusive therapist. Or the person getting the therapy is unreasonable and unreceptive. Here's one that really illustrates all of Reddit's worst qualities. You don't owe anyone anything ever. Conflicts that are set up to demonize people for expecting bare minimum social niceties. Or conflicts that are meant to encourage antisocial behavior. Reddit loves a conflict where one person is obviously being an extremely rude weirdo, and everyone's being like, yeah, go you, the only person you need to think about is yourself. Then there's totally epic revenge, or a scorned person gets revenge on somebody for a perceived slight, which may be completely disproportionate to the severity of the initial offense. Like, am I wrong for setting my ex-friend's car on fire when she tried to flirt with my husband? And like, the audience will probably think that person's in the wrong, but there's also like a 25% chance that they won't. Here's one that could be one of the ragiest Ragebait categories of all, tossed collection. The villain disposes of somebody's entire collection without their permission, usually because they think that it's childish or immature. In these stories, the villain is usually a parent or partner, and at least on Reddit, the audience basically never sympathizes for the person who did the tossing. For example, am I the asshole for throwing out my boyfriend's Pokemon cards when he was at work? And the collection she tossed has a total resale value of about $10,000. Finally, we've got a group of catch-all subcategories whose variants often show up in other categories but end up here when they don't apply. Like general tantrum thrower, where the conflict involves a person prone to tantrums or screaming fits. General entitled, where the villain is entitled to something that doesn't belong to them. General destruction, where something gets destroyed or ruined. General hygiene, involving somebody with a severe personal hygiene issue. And general crime, where the conflict involves something legally actionable. Next category, roommates. First up, boundary issues. One roommate is disturbed by the other roommate's lack of regard for their personal space. Or one of them thinks they're much closer friends with their roommate than the other believes. For example, a post where somebody's roommate keeps sleeping on OP's bed instead of their own. A common one is irresponsible roommate, or a roommate who doesn't do their share of housework and or doesn't pay their share of rent and utilities. This is one of those categories where it's usually pretty safe to assume that it's not fictional unless there's something really outlandish about it. Next is roommate, where the conflict centers around a roommate having sex disruptively or in inappropriate places, like somebody finding out that their roommate has been screwing on the common room couches and on food surfaces in the kitchen. Then there's a surprise extra roommate, where somebody has a partner or friend around so often that it becomes a problem. Like somebody who has their boyfriend over at all hours every day of the week and he doesn't pay rent or contribute to the household. Then there's one that I've affectionately named after my nickname for one of my previous roommates, Trash Tornado, where the roommate is so severely messy that their filth consumes the entire apartment, or the filth within their own personal space is so severe that it's starting to cause problems. For example, somebody with such a horrifically messy bedroom that the whole apartment starts getting a roach problem as a result. Finally, hygiene problems, where a roommate has a serious personal cleanliness issue, like refusing to shower, free bleeding, leaving poop in the toilet, or bedwetting on shared furniture. Next category, step/adoptive family. Conflict between non-blood relatives or half-siblings. Beginning with evil step-parent. A step-parent refuses to integrate their partner's existing children into their life. This one is frequently paired with the evil step-parent attempting to replace the existing stepchildren with children from their new relationship. Much less common than that one is the benevolent step-parent, where the step-parent is the kind and understanding party when the bio-parent is toxic, neglectful, or abusive. Next is preferred children, which often goes hand in hand with the evil step-parent, but also may refer to an adoptive family. This is where the blood-related children are given strong preferential treatment in comparison with step or adoptive children. Then there's Why Don't You Love Me, where the step or adoptive parents are unsympathetic about why they may be having trouble bonding with their non-biological kids, usually involving the kids not accepting them as their new mom or dad. For example, a stepmom freaking out when her stepdaughter pushes her away from an attempted hug. Next is rejected mixed family, or conflicts involving contentious relationships between two sets of children from different parents. Like when one stepsister makes an earnest attempt to try to include the other in their family, and the other stepsister aggressively resists this whenever possible. One subcategory that's usually more sad than ragebait, but can still be either one, is involuntary caregiver, where a child is placed under the care of a non-parent due to extenuating circumstances, and the new caregiver is emotionally, physically, or financially not prepared to care for that child. Then there's bio versus adoptive, or conflicts between the biological and adoptive family. This usually falls into one of the following: bad bio family, where the biological family is the villain, or bad adoptive family, where the adoptive family is the villain. Next is adopting for Jesus, where a family raises adoptive or foster children out of a sense of religious obligation and not out of a passion of caring for those children. This one has a very substantial overlap with the preferred children subcategory. Lastly, there's surprise adopted, where an adoptive child's parents withhold the information that they're adopted until that child finds out by some other means. Frequently, this one also fits into surprise DNA results. Next category, toxic workplace. Conflicts involving employment, employer-employee relations, or employee-customer relations. First up is evil boss, where the boss is the villain. This may involve unfair treatment of employees, abusive leadership practices, wage theft, bad pay, or other issues that stem from management. Like a boss who steals his employees' tips as a penalty for not working as fast as he wants them to. Next is evil HR, where the villain is the human resources department or a representative of it. There are a couple different forms of this conflict, but it usually either involves an inadequate or total lack of response to workplace harassment, or a total overreaction to an incident that the OP claims did not happen. Then there's evil coworker, where the villain is on a same or similar level as the person they're in conflict with. For example, a coworker changing somebody's reports to contain minor errors so they're not considered for a promotion. A less common subcategory is evil subordinate, where the villain is a new or low-level employee in conflict with a senior employee or manager. More common is the evil recruiter, like a job interview where the recruiter was playing Candy Crush under his desk for the whole time and kept asking the interviewee to repeat himself because he wasn't listening. Next is nepotism, or posts where the villain is employed by virtue of their connection to a higher-up at the company, especially if they are completely unsuited for that role. Moving on from inter-employee conflict, the largest customer subcategory is Karen, or Kevin. where the villain is a customer who makes a scene or otherwise has a huge overreaction to a normal customer service issue. For example, a post where the Karen throws a hot coffee at an employee because she said she wouldn't get a refund if she kept and ate the food she was served. Then there's shitty tip, where the conflict involves a failure to tip or an inadequate tip. This one is more likely to have the customer be the villain, but occasionally not. Like a post titled, "The waitress followed me out to my car after I didn't tip her after getting the worst service of my life." Next is refused service, where a customer is denied access to a service or product in a way that may or may not be justified. Like somebody getting bounced from a nightclub when somebody else was breaking the rules. Except the details reveal that the rule breaker was his friend and the OP was egging him on the whole time. Finally, we've got customer v. customer, where the conflict is between a customer and another customer. This one may include a Karen or a Kevin, or a battle between a couple of them. Next category, transit and travel. Posts involving transit or vacation-related conflict. First in this category is the ever-classic unhinged passenger, where a passenger on public transit, or occasionally the driver if it's a rideshare situation, behaves erratically or inappropriately. And whether the author intended it or not, this one also frequently falls under the classification of unreasonable mentally ill, because these ones often demonize people who are clearly experiencing some kind of mental crisis. Then there's the highly polarizing crying baby, where the conflict involves a baby or young child screaming inconsolably on an airplane or other long-distance transit. It's basically a toss-up whether Reddit is going to take issue with the baby or the person complaining. The comments on these posts are often much more split than other types. After that, we've got road rage, where the conflict involves somebody becoming recklessly angry after perceived slight in traffic. Alternately, they could be a reckless driver in general, or driving recklessly as a means of threatening the people in the car with them. Like somebody whose boyfriend starts swerving around in traffic anytime he gets mad at his girlfriend when she's in the passenger seat. Next is assigned seats, or conflict around seating arrangement in transit with assigned seats, or assigned placement in coach business and first-class cabins. Usually involves the audience giving a proverbial standing ovation to whoever refused to switch their seat. If the seating isn't pre-assigned, then that turns into seating rights, or conflict about who gets to sit and who does not. This especially pertains to elderly, pregnant, or disabled passengers. For example, a pregnant woman refusing to give up her seat for the sake of another pregnant woman. Except the audience decides that they are not cool with this because the OP is in her early first trimester and the woman she didn't get up for is in her late third. Then there's backseat driver, where the conflict stems from unwelcome but occasionally justified commentary on the driver's skills or choices. Like a post entitled, "Am I the asshole because I've told my mom that she can either shut up about my driving or do her own errands?" Except that the criticism in question is telling her son to not run red lights and stop signs. Then there's possibly the most contentious relationship that you can find on a road, car versus biker. Conflict between a person in a car and a person on a bike. Like somebody who's pulled over into a bike lane for no reason other than their own convenience, who gets mad when somebody punches their car. Switching gears to the vacation-related subcategories, we've got vacation invitation, a conflict involving who is or is not invited to a vacation. For example, the OP's sister-in-law assumes that she's welcome to come on their romantic two-person vacation with them, except neither of them want her to go. That one would also slot into in-laws, they won't leave. The opposite of issues surrounding who gets to come is staying home, where somebody refrains from going on a vacation that others will be attending, either voluntarily or due to negligent planning. Like somebody whose husband doesn't start packing for their cruise until an hour before they're supposed to leave, and so she ends up just going on the cruise without him. Next is sudden change of plans, where the vacation plans are altered drastically in a way that's causing a problem. For example, somebody who planned a relaxing spa getaway type vacation has their wife hijack their planning and change their itinerary from that to a fast-paced, exhausting tour of multiple cities where every daylight hour is booked. Last in this category is unprepared vacationer, where a person goes on a vacation with a serious planning failure, like failing to reserve a place to stay, running out of money midway through, or only packing enough for a single day. Like, beg packers? Those people who intentionally travel to countries known for their generous hospitality with not enough money to support themselves? If somebody wrote an AmITheAsshole post about one of those, it would go here. We are finally reaching the home stretch. The two next categories, Unreasonable Majorities and Unreasonable Minorities, may possibly account for the largest amount of bait posts that you can find on Reddit. As such, nearly all of these subcategories have a lot of frequently used microcategories. To be clear, the micro-categories aren't all-inclusive, so if the post clearly falls under unreasonable white person but doesn't match any of the micro-categories, then it's just unreasonable white person with no further categorization. Let's waste no time here. Next category, unreasonable majorities, or otherwise not oppressed. People who use their innate social advantage over others to be terrible, or who just don't realize that they're being terrible. First up, unreasonable white person. The villain is an ignorant or malicious white person, usually involving matters of race or ethnicity. On rare occasions, this involves a non-white person behaving indistinguishably from an unreasonable white person. Some common variants of this one include just a racist. Self-explanatory. Misguided social justice. A white person is trying to claim that something is racist or harmful cultural appropriation when the people of the relevant culture don't agree. For example, the unreasonable white person tells another white person that they're doing harmful cultural appropriation for being a regular at an Ethiopian restaurant. And misguided inclusivity. A white person fumbles their attempt to be inclusive of another culture by repeating ignorant or stereotyped information, or that which involves an entirely wrong culture. For example, somebody trying to speak Japanese to an Indonesian person and getting laughed at. Next is unreasonable cishet. The villain is an ignorant or malicious cisgender heterosexual person, or at least one or the other. Variants include, so who's the man? The villain is asking inappropriate questions to an LGBT person or couple, especially one who's a stranger. It's just a phase. The cishet doesn't believe that LGBT identity is legitimate and assumes that the person will just get over it. For example, somebody laughing at their son when he expresses that he's never going to be willing to be married to a woman. Finally, there's coming out freakout, where a person has an extremely negative reaction to a person coming out, especially in the context of a parent reacting to a child. Then there's unreasonable abled person, where the villain is an ignorant or malicious abled person. Variants include, you don't need that. The villain disposes of or withholds important medication or assistive devices because they believe that the disabled person would be better off without it. For example, a mom finding and flushing her son's prescription Adderall. Ask Jesus to help you, where the villain is a religious or spiritual person who believes that disability and illness is caused by sin or bad vibes. What ADA? The villain is an educator or authority figure who refuses to accommodate their disabled pupil. For example, a teacher who refuses to allow her students to wear sound-blocking earplugs or ear covers because they assume that they'll cause him to not listen, even though the opposite is the case. Have you tried yoga? The abled person gives unwarranted and ignorant medical advice, like a person insisting to a type 1 diabetic that their illness could be cured by going on a month-long kale juice cleanse. Lastly, there's have you considered not being disabled? Where the abled person expects the disabled person to do something that is clearly prevented by their disability. Like somebody assuming that a person with very poor leg function is just choosing not to take the stairs out of laziness. After that is unreasonable rich, where the villain is an ignorant or malicious rich person. Sometimes the person isn't really rich, but just financially privileged in comparison to the person that they're in conflict with. Variants include, mine! The villain refuses to financially assist someone that they have legal responsibility for or a close friend, especially if the amount of money requested would be trivial for the giver and life-changing for the receiver. For example, somebody who allows their mom to go homeless even though they could easily cover a couple months' rent and who has no upbringing-related reason to leave her in the lurch like that. Although Reddit loves a you got mine story, so it's kind of a toss-up whether this one would go in unreasonable rich or unreasonable poor. Next up is ladder puller, where the villain sabotages people from finding financial success or stability in the same way that they took advantage of in the past, like by choking out long-term job opportunities or voting out social policies that they benefited from in the past. Then there's oblivious rich, where the rich person doesn't notice or just doesn't care that the other people around them don't have the same kind of purchasing power that they do. Like somebody whose friend always insists on going out to expensive gourmet restaurants and then splitting the bill 50-50, especially if they get a fancy 5-course meal and 2 bottles of wine, while the OP only gets a side salad. The final of the unreasonable majorities is the unreasonable American, where the villain is an ignorant or malicious American. Occasionally this person is not literally American, but is one in spirit. Variants include, speak American! The villain is hostile and unaccommodating of tourists and immigrants who aren't perfectly assimilated into American culture, like somebody who screams at their hotel staff for not speaking English. Then there's idiot tourist, where the villain is a tourist and expects that other country to cater to their personal preferences, especially ones that go against local culture. Like somebody renting an Airbnb right next to a place that's well known to play loud live music every single night and trying to get the cops to shut them down. If the person in that scenario is a permanent resident, then it becomes idiot expat. Next category, Unreasonable Minorities. Conflicts where the villain's minority status is directly related to their foolishness. This is a big one, quite possibly the largest bait category that there is. I would like to remind everyone of those rules we established at the beginning of this video. Namely the one about how even if a person gets sorted as an unreasonable whatever, doesn't mean that they're actually being unreasonable, it's just that the audience has decided that they are. Let's begin with Unreasonable POC. The villain is evil because they're a person of color. This one has two common variants. One, a person is accused of racism or discrimination in retaliation for an unrelated offense. For example, somebody gets written up at work for arriving late too often, and later on they portray that as a racially motivated attack. And two, the villain character is prejudiced against and discriminatory towards white people. Unreasonable POC is probably the least common of the unreasonable minority categories, probably because they usually aren't received that well and might end up as an unreasonable white person's story regardless of the author's intention. Next is Unreasonable Gay. The villain is evil because they are gay or otherwise queer, but not trans. We're getting to that one. This includes the following variants: moral panic bait. A gay person exposes young people to things that are deemed inappropriate for their age group. This could be something as innocuous as family-friendly drag, or something that crosses the line into the actual non-right-wing definition of grooming. Next is time waster, where the gay person withholds their actual sexuality until they're deep into a long-term heterosexual relationship, especially if they did not recently learn that fact about themselves. Next is the reverse coming out freakout, where a gay person comes out and is upset by receiving the wrong reaction when that reaction is not negative. Like a person who interprets a supportive but calm reaction to their announcement as a rejection. And lastly, how dare you be straight? Where the gay person gets upset with the person that they're trying to flirt with for the unforgivable crime of being heterosexual. This one's been getting popular lately, Unreasonable Trans Person, where the villain is evil because they're transgender. This one comes in a lot of different forms, but I've found that it most often boils down into two microcategories. First, the AGP caricature. The villain of the story is a trans woman, usually non-transitioned, who is clearly motivated by sexual perversion. Nearly every single one of these that I read is an obvious type BS from my vantage point, but the audience is way more likely to be completely credulous. Second is misgendering freakout, where the trans person, usually non-transitioned, becomes aggressive after being mistaken for their assigned gender at birth. I'm not saying that this never happens, but it's much less likely to happen in real life than online. Next up, Unreasonable Fat Person. The villain is evil because they are fat. This one is such a common type of bait that it's kind of become a running joke. Variants include can dish it but can't take it, where the fat person is rude to another person but then responds negatively when that person criticizes their weight. This is often in regards to other unhealthy behaviors, namely cigarette smoking. Then there's gluttony, where the conflict revolves around the fat person eating too much or eating food that isn't theirs. Finally, size accessibility, where the fat person is upset about being excluded from a weight-restricted activity. Alternatively, they may be upset that a thinner person is using something that would better accommodate their size. For example, a person who weighs 300 pounds being upset that they're not allowed to ride a horse. Size accessibility also includes the micro category of the fat person insisting on participating in that weight-restricted activity and then causing injury or breaking something. Like if the person in that previous post chose to ride that horse anyway and injured them both. Next, Unreasonable Disabled Person, where the villain is evil because they're disabled, or at least are associated with someone who is disabled. First, we've got the Family Ruiner, where the disabled person is the source of resentment for requiring so much attention and resources. Along those lines is Center of Attention, involving the disabled person receiving or demanding preferential treatment for their disability. Like the OP paid in excess of $1,000 to get premium seating at this concert, and then they have to share their space with a disabled person who got it for free. Probably the most common type in this category is Unreasonable Caregiver. This is where the disabled person's carer is the source of the conflict, either for being over-permissive, spoiling, or treating others unfairly in favor of the disabled person. One you'll see a lot are developmentally disabled children who are allowed to be destructive in another person's house, while their caretaker makes excuses for them and fails to redirect that behavior. Then there's accommodation rage, where the disabled person becomes belligerently upset because their disability prevents them from participating in something that abled people can, especially if the requested accommodation would be physically impossible or unrealistically burdensome. A slightly less common variant is unreasonable allergic, where a person with a severe allergy, or at least who claims to have a severe allergy, is controlling of other people's access to that allergen to an excessive degree. For example, a person who's allergic to peanuts forbidding their friends from having peanut products at their own homes. Finally, there's reverse have you considered not being disabled, which is like the unreasonable abled person category insofar that an able person expects a disabled person to do something that their disability obviously prevents them from doing, except the audience agrees that they just ought to do it anyways. Then there's unreasonable neurodivergent / mentally ill. Unreasonable autistic, the conflict centers a person's autism. The most common form is the autistic person failing to recognize a social cue that makes others uncomfortable or annoyed with them. Next, unreasonable OCD. The conflict centers a person's obsessive-compulsive disorder. The most common form are people with filth or disorder-based obsessions who impose unreasonable standards of cleanliness on others. Unreasonable ADD/ADHD. The conflict centers a person's ADD. The most common form is being unable to handle a communal living situation, failing to do their share of housework, or failing to complete important tasks in a timely manner. Unreasonable DID. The conflict centers a person's dissociative identity disorder. The most common form is deflecting blame for their bad behavior onto an evil alter and refusing to take responsibility for the actions of that alter. Unreasonable anxiety. The conflict centers a person's anxiety. The most common form is conflicts over learned helplessness. Unreasonable schizophrenic, or conflict centering a person's schizophrenia, most commonly involves accusations that stem from delusions. And finally, unreasonable unmedicated, which can overlap with any of the above categories, where the conflict stems from a neurodivergent or mentally ill person who has gone off their medication or refuses to be medicated. Up next, unreasonable poor, where the villain is evil because they're impoverished or homeless. This has two most common variants, the first being unreasonable broke, where the poor person feels entitled to another person's money, shelter, or resources. This one has a large thematic overlap with financial fumbles. Next is unreasonable homeless, where the conflict involves a homeless person, especially one who is cartoonishly sinister in a way that seems like it's meant to be fear-mongering. Then there's unreasonable elder, where the villain is evil because they're old. Variants include back in my day, where the old person expects the culture to be the same as when they were young. Entitled elder, where the old person expects other people to do labor for them or give them preferential treatment. Like somebody who's shamed by their elderly neighbors by not offering to mow their lawn for free, especially if their lawn is much larger than the OP's. And finally, dementia, where the conflict is caused by delusions or distortions caused by the elder's dementia. And I admit that this last one is kind of stretching the definition of minority, but the last one is unreasonable vegan. The villain is evil because they're vegan or vegetarian. These conflicts usually involve butting heads with people who choose to eat meat or people who are choosing to no longer be vegan. Next and final category, wedding derangement. Posts involving a wedding fiasco. First and obviously, bridezilla, sometimes groomzilla. The problem involves a bride or groom with unreasonable expectations. For example, am I the asshole for disinviting 3 women from my wedding after they refused to comply with the dress code? And in this case, the dress code means that every woman under the age of 65 has to be wearing heels that are at least 4 inches tall. Next is overbearing parent, where the parents of one or both of the marrying couple insert themselves into the planning process more than they're welcome to. Like someone whose mom goes and changes their wedding cake order behind their back. Then there's the saboteur, where a bridesmaid, groomsman, or other important attendee of the wedding is going out of their way to sabotage it. Like the groom's best man hiring escorts for his party without his permission and then dropping hints about it to his fiancée. Next is my wedding now, where a relative or friend attending the wedding makes unreasonable demands or insists that the wedding cater to their personal tastes. Like someone's mother-in-law insisting that the only dress she can wear is an extremely ostentatious white gown that she wore at her own wedding. Invitation issues is a big one, or conflict involving who is or is not invited to the wedding. Like somebody's best friend threatening to end their friendship because they've decided to have a family-only wedding. Related but distinct is attendance issues, or a conflict pertaining to which of the invited guests show up. Like if somebody has their wedding in Vegas and their mom gets so distracted by the hotel casino that she ends up missing the ceremony completely. If that mom lost track of time because she was hitting the drinks, that one might also qualify as booze issues. Or conflict involving the availability of alcohol at a wedding or the lack thereof. Like somebody whose alcoholic family members threaten not to attend a wedding if there isn't going to be an open bar. Sometimes booze issues ends up turning into nightmare guest, where an attendee single-handedly ruins the wedding for everyone with their antics. Like a post titled, "A groomsman got sloppy drunk and poured red wine all the way down the front of my wedding dress before the ceremony." Next is wedding party drama, where members of the wedding party are being mean and petty, or alternately somebody is upset about their lack of inclusion in the wedding party, or about someone else's inclusion. Exorbitant costs is another common one, where the attendance of the wedding involves outlandish costs, like travel, dress code, venue fees, expected gifts, or other expenses. Like someone having a destination wedding that costs an unreimbursed $5,000 per person, not including travel costs. Then there's serial marrier, where a person gets divorced and remarried with unusual frequency, especially if they make excessive demands of the guests with each wedding or spend excessively for each one. Next is left at the altar, where one half of the marrying couple calls it quits very shortly before or on the day of the wedding. If it's not the bride or groom who's flaking, then it might be left with the altar. Or an important or essential wedding service is canceled at the last minute, like the venue or catering. Like if the venue was scheduled to host the wedding months in advance, but then a higher bidder comes along, and the contract they signed wasn't strong enough for the venue to not just pull the rug out from under the marrying couple just a week before their wedding. And finally this time, there is scorned worker, or a person who is working to support the wedding is treated unfairly. Classic example of this is refusing to allow the photographer, who you expect to be working basically non-stop during the entire ceremony and reception, to eat any of the catered meal. I know I said at the beginning of this video that this list would be comprehensive, and believe me, I tried my very best to make it so. But let's be honest, I could probably sort 1,000 Reddit posts in a row and there would still be gaps on this list. So leave a comment if you think I forgot something. I'll be reading those later with my head in my hands being like, oh my god, how could I have possibly forgotten that one? Even beyond the conflict and narrative structure types, there's a huge amount of super common repeated phrases and little mini tropes that are only tangential to the post they're in that I didn't include here because I didn't feel like doing that to myself. I'll leave a link to a written version of this list, maybe not immediately after this is uploaded, but at least shortly after, that you can reference and sort posts that you find on your own. You could join my Discord and post that in the Categorizing Reddit Ragebait channel. Or you could even make your own subreddit for that kind of thing. I don't know. I could do that, but I don't feel like it. As always, the best way to support me is by subscribing to my Patreon. All paying members get access to my backlog of exclusive videos, and I'm not going to make any promises because I know better now. The My Scene CD review is still being worked on, it's just slow. But I'm considering doing a little look back at the fake Reddit posts that I've written myself. I am an expert in this field after all, and some of those fake posts have been very successful. So if you want to see that as a Patreon exclusive, leave a comment and let me know, because I'm more likely to make videos that I know people are interested in. Thank you so much to Cheyenne, Con, Dr. Dreamerella, Fishcatch, Grizzly, Luca Anastasius, Ms. Goat, Nicole Manassian, and Ren. Okay, bye.